He wasn't supposed to come home that day. No announcements. No staff alerted. Just a billionaire stepping into his mansion after a string of sleepless nights, hoping to find silence, and instead hearing something he hadn't heard in weeks. Laughter. His infant son's laughter. And when he followed the sound to the kitchen, he froze. There, standing barefoot on the tiled floor, was the maid, a black woman he'd barely spoken to, cradling his child in her arms, whispering something soft, while his tiny hands reached up to touch her face. She wasn't supposed to be holding him. She wasn't even supposed to be alone with him. But what stunned him most wasn't what she was doing. It was the way his son looked at her, like he'd already made up his mind about who really cared for him, what happened next. Unraveled everything the billionaire thought he knew about trust class and the true meaning of family. It was just past 6 in the morning when Julian Carrington's black Aston Martin glided through the quiet gates of his countryside estate. The sky over Greenwich was still a dusky blue, streaked with the first hints of gold. His driver offered to bring in the luggage, but Julian shook his head. He wanted quiet. He wanted solitude. After 3 nights in Zurich, handling a shareholder crisis and flying through 2 time zones, all he craved was to walk into his home and hear nothing but silence. That's why, when he heard faint giggling coming from the back corridor near the kitchen, he stopped mid-step. He frowned. His son Theo had just turned 1. He was a quiet baby, still in sleep training, usually asleep until 8. The nanny missed. Ingram followed a rigid schedule. It didn't make sense. Julian set his suitcase down and followed the sound, his Italian leather shoes making soft, deliberate taps on the marble floor. The laughter grew clearer, brighter, punctuated by a soft, melodic voice, humming something that didn't belong to any lullaby playlist he'd ever heard. As he stepped closer to the kitchen threshold, what he saw made him stop cold. Amara, the maid, a black woman in a plain Navy House uniform. Barefoot, her curly hair tied up in a loose scarf, stood in front of the farmhouse sink. She held Theo in one arm while gently bouncing him on her hip, a bottle in her other hand. His son, the heir to the Carrington name, was curled up into her like he'd been there 100 times before. Theo wasn't just calm, he was radiant, giggling, reaching up to touch her nose. Julian didn't move. He couldn't. 1,000 questions collided in his mind at once. Where was Ingram? Why was this woman, the cleaning staff, holding his son? How long had this been happening? But even louder than the questions was something else. A feeling he couldn't place. He watched as Amara slowly lowered Theo into a cushioned basket on the kitchen island. She hummed softly, adjusting his blanket, then kissed the top of his head with a tenderness that stopped Julian's breath in his chest. He didn't know what to feel. Outrage, confusion, gratitude. He stepped forward, and the wood creaked beneath his foot. Amara turned, startled, her eyes locking with his. She didn't flinch, but her body stiffened just slightly. "Mr. Carrington," she said softly, her voice composed but unsure. "I didn't expect you back this early." Julian looked at her, then at Theo, still peaceful now, drifting into sleep. I can see that, he said, his voice low. And just like that, the silence between them became a battlefield, one where neither of them understood the rules yet. Julian folded his arms, eyes fixed on Amara. "What happened to Ingram?" he asked, keeping his voice, even though the weight of the moment pressed against his temples. Amara straightened. "She called out sick yesterday evening. Said she had a fever. I tried reaching your assistant, but the line went to voicemail." Julian clenched his jaw. His assistant Claire had been stuck rerouting his Zurich meetings all night. He hadn't checked in since boarding the plane. And so he said slowly, "You decided to improvise." "I didn't see it as improvising, Amara," replied her tone careful but not apologetic. Theo woke up crying around 4:30. He was sweating. His skin was warm and his breathing. It worried me. "You're not his nanny," Julian said, sharply gesturing toward her. "You clean. You're not trained to assess anything." She took a breath. "I know that. But I've been around children before. I helped raise my younger brothers. And when a child is in distress, you don't wait for a title to give you permission to care." He blinked, caught off guard by her steadiness. This wasn't the frightened, deferential reaction he expected. No apologizing. No stammering. Just calm, quiet resolve. Theo stirred in the basket, shifting gently. Julian glanced down, his expression softening for just a moment. The boy looked content, wrapped tightly in a warm knit blanket. His breathing was slow, peaceful. Amara's voice came again, softer this time. I used a forehead thermometer. His temperature was slightly elevated, but I cooled him down gradually. He took his bottle and settled within the hour. I was going to call your office as soon as it opened. Julian exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He wasn't used to not being in control. And right now, the sight of his only child being comforted by a woman he barely knew was unraveling something deeper than inconvenience. How long have you been doing this? He asked. She tilted her head. Doing what? Holding him, feeding him, calming him, like this. Amara's eyes didn't shy away. Since the second week I started here, when Ingram wasn't around and Theo wouldn't stop crying. I picked him up. He stopped. Julian was silent. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. No fear, no theatrics, no overstepping, just the plain truth. And that truth carved its way into Julian's mind like a quiet accusation. Because now that he was really looking, really seeing, he recognized something he hadn't before. His son trusted her. And that trust hadn't come from one night. It had been built little by little in the quiet corners of this home while he'd been in boardrooms on planes closing deals. And here was Amara, the woman who scrubbed his floors, folding his son into her arms as if she were born to protect him. And somehow, Julian felt like the outsider in his own kitchen. Julian didn't speak for a long while. He watched Amara gently place Theo back into his crib in the sunroom, tucking him in, with a tenderness that made Julian's chest tighten. The room went quiet again, save for the occasional chirp from the garden beyond the glass doors. I'm not angry, Julian said finally, his voice low. I just wasn't expecting any of this. Amara nodded. Neither was I. He turned toward her. You've worked here how long now? 3.5 months, she answered. Started right after Christmas. And before that, her pause was brief. I cleaned townhomes in Kensington. Before that, I was a teacher. In South London. Julian raised an eyebrow. A teacher primary school, she said. English and maths. Then what happened? Amara hesitated. Life happened. My mom got sick. I had to take care of her and my younger siblings. Teaching doesn't pay enough for a family of 5 living in a council flat. He leaned against the marble counter. So you ended up here, cleaning the houses of people like me. Her gaze flicked to his for just a moment. No, Mr. Halifax. I ended up here helping raise the son of a man who doesn't know how to look past uniforms. Her words weren't angry, just precise, like the truth spoken plainly. Julian felt a pang of discomfort, not from offense, but from recognition. You think I'm arrogant, he muttered. I think you're used to controlling the terms of every conversation, she replied. And I think your son doesn't care what I wear or where I'm from. He just knows I'm here when he needs me. Julian couldn't argue with that. He didn't want to. Because beneath her soft-spoken calm, Amara wasn't simply a maid. There was steel in her, the kind of grace people mistook for obedience. But he could see it now. She wasn't here for his approval. She never had been. You're not like the others, he said after a moment. She tilted her head. Because I'm not afraid to speak, no, Julian replied. Because you don't need anything from me, but you gave something anyway. She gave a small smile. Not everything in life has to be transactional. Julian looked toward the sunroom where Theo now slept peacefully. And suddenly the silence in the house felt different. Not empty, not cold, but lived in. Why didn't you tell me who you were before you took this job? He asked. Amara looked confused. Who I am, Julian gestured vaguely. You said you taught. You're clearly educated. You could be doing more than wiping down counters. She gave a quiet laugh. You assume that because someone's cleaning, it's all they're capable of. Maybe I chose this. Maybe I needed quiet. Maybe it's none of your business. He chuckled in spite of himself. Fair. Amara turned to gather her things, slipping her phone into her pocket and reaching for her jacket. If there's nothing else, I'll be going. Theo should sleep for another hour or so. I prepped his formula for later. Julian nodded, watching her with a gaze he hadn't used. In years, not the businessman's stare, but something gentler, more human. Amara, he said just as she reached the door. She turned back. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for today. For all the days I didn't notice." She met his eyes, really met them for the first time. "You're welcome," she said quietly. And then she was gone, leaving Julian alone in the stillness, staring at the space she'd just occupied. The woman he hadn't noticed had just dismantled the walls he thought made him strong. Julian didn't go back to work that afternoon. For the first time in years, he canceled all his meetings, silenced his phone, and just listened to the quiet hum of the house, to the rustle of trees outside the nursery window, to the faint breathing of his son as he napped. And somewhere in that stillness, his thoughts began to shift. He had built a life where power was measured in leverage control and distance. But in that kitchen, one quiet morning, Amara had shattered the illusion that respect could be bought or inherited. Later that evening, after Theo had fallen asleep again, Julian sat in his study, scrolling through the security logs. He found Amara's original application form, her resume, the references, everything he'd never bothered to read. She hadn't lied about her background, but she hadn't emphasized it either. No prestigious school names highlighted, no special accolades, just quiet competence, quiet presence. She hadn't needed to impress him. The next morning, Julian was already awake when Amara arrived. He opened the door himself. "Good morning," he said. She blinked, surprised to see him at the threshold. "Morning, sir. You can call me Julian." Amara gave him a skeptical look, but stepped inside, without a word. In the kitchen, he poured 2 cups of tea. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was respectful. He handed her a cup. "I read your file last night," he said simply. She said nothing, only stirred her tea. "I didn't know," he added. "How capable you are. How overqualified you are." She took a sip. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" The question hung between them, like a challenge. Julian looked at her, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd like to think maybe today it would." Amara nodded slowly, accepting that answer, not as forgiveness, but as recognition. Later that week, everything began to shift. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand announcements or sweeping gestures, just small changes. Julian began working from home more often. He learned how to feed Theo without spilling. He walked him around the garden, talking softly about everything and nothing. And Amara, though still quiet, began to take up more space in the house, not as a servant, but as someone trusted. One afternoon, while folding Theo's clothes in the laundry room, Amara found a handwritten envelope tucked beneath a stack of fresh towels. Her name was written on the front. She opened it slowly. Inside was a note. "Amara, you don't owe anyone an explanation for your intelligence, your gentleness, or your presence. But I owe you a sincere apology for not seeing the strength behind the silence. I see it now, and I'm grateful. Julian." She folded the note, pressed it to her chest, and for the first time since taking the job, she let herself cry, not out of frustration, but out of something else. Out of the feeling that maybe her presence finally meant something beyond the tasks on her checklist. And in another part of the house, Julian stood quietly watching the monitor, not to intrude, but simply to witness, to see the woman who had changed everything by just being who she was. The next few weeks moved with a rhythm neither of them expected. Julian found himself drifting toward the nursery, even during work calls, just to catch a glimpse of Theo napping or to hear Amara humming that same gentle tune she always sang while rocking him. He never asked what the song was. He didn't need to. It belonged to her, and somehow now it belonged to Theo too. They began to talk, not just about schedules or formula, but about life, little things. Julian learned that Amara used to study literature in college before she had to drop out, to care for her grandmother. He learned she once wanted to be a teacher, that she still read poetry when the house was quiet, that she missed autumns in Georgia because the leaves turned red like fire. And Amara, in turn, learned things about Julian he rarely shared, that he lost his mother at a young age, that he never felt like he belonged in the rooms where his father raised him, that he thought he had built everything for success, but often went to bed wondering if it was all just expensive noise. One night, a storm rolled in over the city. Theo cried louder than usual, restless and startled by the thunder. Amara was already in the nursery when Julian arrived, soaked from sprinting across the yard to Grab the forgotten stroller. You don't have to, she said gently, seeing the water drip from his hair. He didn't answer. He just took off his wet blazer and sat beside her. Together they calmed the baby. In the dim light of the nursery lamp, Julian looked at Amara not as someone who worked for him, but as someone who stood with him through sleepless nights, through silence, through storms, both real and personal. And it was then, with Theo nestled between them, that something unspoken passed between their glances. A shift, not romantic, not yet, but something foundational, respect. At breakfast the next morning, Julian made the coffee. He overfilled the filter, and Amara didn't correct him. She just smiled and handed him a towel when it overflowed. He turned to her and said, "Would you stay?" She hesitated. "I already work full-time." "No," he said. "I mean, would you stay as Theo's guardian? Permanently, more than an employee. I want you to be part of his life. Officially." Amara blinked. "You don't have to do that out of gratitude." "I'm not," he replied. "I'm doing it because when Theo looks at you, he sees home. And I think I do too." Silence fell again, but this time it felt different. Warmer, lighter. Amara didn't say yes that morning. She didn't say no either. But when Julian left the kitchen, she stayed seated a moment longer, stirring her coffee and wondering how a job she nearly declined had become the place where her heart began to reassemble itself. The official papers came a week later. It wasn't an adoption. Not yet. That wasn't what Julian was asking for. It was a legal guardianship agreement drawn up by his most trusted attorney outlining Amara's role, not as a nanny, but as Theo's primary caregiver with full medical authority, decision-making rights, and financial security to match. Julian left it on the kitchen counter unsigned with a note in his handwriting, "I trust you. Theo already does. I'm just catching up." Amara didn't rush to sign. She took the paper, folded it neatly, and tucked it in the back of a worn, hardcover journal, one she had been writing in since her grandmother passed. That night, she sat by Theo's crib and whispered stories of her childhood, wondering what it meant to belong to a family that didn't start with blood, but might end in love. Meanwhile, the mansion buzzed with quiet rumors. The staff noticed. Housekeepers whispered that the billionaire now left board meetings early just to get back in time for Theo's afternoon nap. Gardeners said they saw him laughing in the backyard, laughing as Amara chased Theo barefoot through the grass. But not everyone was pleased. Julian's sister Eleanor arrived one Sunday morning with sharp heels and sharper questions. "She's still the maid, Julian," she said over espresso in the parlor. "Are we really doing this?" Elevating her, giving her access, Julian looked up from his coffee slowly. "She's the only reason my son still knows how to smile," he replied. "You ever managed to do that?" Eleanor blinked. But he didn't wait for a response. "Amara's not the help anymore. She's family." That word family echoed even after she left. Julian began to make small changes. He added Amara's name to emergency contact forms. He introduced her to his board of trustees as Theo's guardian. And when someone asked, "You mean the nanny?" He didn't correct them with words, just with a glance that said, "Watch yourself." Still, Amara struggled. At night, when Theo slept and the house grew quiet, she would sit on the edge of her bed and question it all. Why me? Why now? Was this real or just a rich man's guilt dressed up in gratitude? And then one night, she found an envelope tucked beneath Theo's crib mattress. Inside was a drawing, a crude crayon sketch of 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one in the middle holding both hands. On the back, written in Julian's handwriting, "Theo calls you Mama when you're not in the room." She wept quietly, not from sadness, but from something deeper, something healing. The next morning she signed the papers, not because she wanted the legal title, but because she realized she'd already earned it. By spring, the change was no longer subtle. Julian had stopped pretending that Amara was just part of the staff. He walked beside her now, not ahead. He sought her opinion during Theo's doctor visits, handed her the family calendar, and once, when a gala invitation came addressed to Mr. Julian Roth and guest, he wrote her name in elegant black ink beside his. But it was Theo who confirmed what no title could. He called her Mama without hesitation now, not by instruction, not by accident, just instinct. And that instinct was what worried Julian's inner circle. The board was nervous, the press curious, and some members of high society quietly furious. A whisper started to travel across estates and cocktail lounges that Julian Roth, the last heir of one of the East Coast's most elite families, was involved with the Black Maid. At a private fundraiser, an old business partner pulled Julian aside, voice low. "Julian, listen, we all admire your generosity, but optics matter." The maid, really, Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just leaned in and replied, "She raised my son, and she's the only one who didn't leave when I fell apart. I don't need optics. I need real." The man never brought it up again. But Amara knew. She saw the glances, felt the shift in how people greeted her like she was a mistake. Julian hadn't noticed yet. She considered stepping back, quietly resigning, disappearing the way women like her had learned to do when the spotlight turned ugly. But then Theo got sick. A sudden fever, a night of chills, and a terrifying moment when he didn't respond to his name. Julian froze. He didn't know what to do, just like the first time. But Amara moved without thinking. She ran the bath, cooled his skin, whispered to him in that same soft voice, called the pediatrician, calmed Julian, held them both. By dawn, Theo's fever had broken, and Julian sat at the foot of the bed, watching Amara rock his son her forehead, resting against his tiny curls, her eyes closed in silent prayer. That morning, something inside Julian shifted again. It wasn't gratitude this time. It was love, not just for his son, but for the woman who had become his son's heart. Julian waited until the estate was quiet before he knocked gently on Amara's bedroom door. She opened it in silence, her expression unreadable. There had been no words exchanged after Theo recovered, just glances, careful silences, and something deeper neither of them dared name. "I want to talk," Julian said. "Not as your employer, not even as Theo's father. Just me." Amara stepped aside. The room was modest. No designer furniture, no lavish art, just warmth. A shelf of used books, a candle that smelled like vanilla and rain. The kind of space someone created to feel safe. Julian sat in the armchair near the window. "I didn't expect any of this," he began. "You weren't in the plan. Neither was Theo, truthfully. I thought fatherhood would be part-time like everything else in my life." Amara stood across from him, arms folded, silent. "I thought I knew what love looked like," he continued. "Expensive, curated, convenient. But I've never been loved the way you love Theo. Not for anything I've achieved. Not for what I have. Just for showing up every day." Amara's voice was soft but steady. He needed someone. "And so did you." Julian met her eyes. "Do you ever wonder why you're still here all the time? Then let me tell you why." He stood, walked slowly to where she stood, and gently took her hand. "Because you taught me that love is not performance. It's presence. And you are the most present person I've ever known." Amara's eyes welled, but she didn't. Let the tears fall. "Julian," she began. "I know it won't be easy," he interrupted. "The press will turn this into something ugly. The board will threaten to resign. People will whisper, but I don't care. You don't owe them silence, and I don't owe them shame." Amara shook her head. "This isn't a fairy tale. I'm not some polished woman from your world." "No," he said softly. "You're not. You're better. You're real. You're the reason Theo laughs in his sleep. And the reason this house finally feels like a home." He stepped back. "I'm not asking you to say anything tonight. I just needed to say it out loud, that I love you, fully, freely, and that if there's a future for us, I'll meet you where you are. No pressure, no spotlight." Amara stood there speechless. She had been erased so many times before, overlooked, dismissed, smiled at, but never seen. But tonight she wasn't invisible. Tonight she was the one thing Julian Roth could not walk away from. Amara didn't sleep that night. She sat by her window, knees pulled to her chest, staring out into the moonlit garden. The words Julian had spoken echoed in her mind, simple, unwavering, terrifying. "I love you." Not because she was needed, not because she was convenient, because she was her. She had never been chosen like that. Not even by Theo's father, who had vanished before their child was born. Not by the foster system that shuffled her from home to home. not by the world that saw her skin before it saw her soul. But Julian had looked straight through every stereotype, every expectation, and said something nobody else had ever dared. "You're not too much. You're exactly what I needed." By morning, she had made her decision. She found Julian in the solarium reading quietly, while Theo napped on his chest. The scene almost undid her, the calm, the warmth, at the image of the man she once feared, holding their boy like he was the only thing in the world. Julian looked up unsure. Amara sat beside him. "I've spent my whole life shrinking," she said. "Trying not to take up space, not to ask for too much, not to be a burden." "You've never been a burden." "I know that now," she replied softly, "because you let me see myself the way Theo sees me." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She reached for his hand. "If this is real," she whispered, "then I'm not running. But we do this on my terms, not for appearances, not for damage control, for love, for Theo." Julian nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I've already started the paperwork," he said. "You're no longer listed as domestic staff. You're listed as family." She blinked, stunned. "You mean?" He pulled a small envelope from his jacket and handed it to her. "Inside a deed. To the house on Waverly Street," he said. "The one you once said reminded you of your favorite novel." Amara stared at the paper. Her name printed boldly under owner. "For the first time in your life," Julian said, "I want you to have something no one can take from you." She didn't cry. Not then. She simply placed her head on his shoulder, the soft rise and fall of Theo's breath between them, and let herself belong. The wedding was quiet. No press, no floral spectacle. Just a garden, a few close friends, and Theo standing proudly as ring-bearer with a smile too big for his little face. Julian wore no tie. Amara wore no veil. But when they faced each other under the willow tree in the back of the Waverly Street house, now their home, everything else faded. "I never thought I'd end up here," Julian said. "Not after losing everything. But you reminded me what home feels like." Amara looked at him steady and strong. "I never thought I'd be seen. But you looked past what I was told I was supposed to be, and you let me just be." Theo tugged at their hands, and laughter rippled through the crowd as they leaned down to include him in the vow. "We promise," Amara whispered, looking into their son's eyes, "to protect your joy, to keep your heart safe, and to always let you win at chess, at least until you're 10, Julian added, grinning. Their first dance wasn't elegant. It was awkward and full of stumbles, but it was real. Julian whispered the lyrics softly into Amara's ear, his voice cracking as he held her close. She didn't cry until that night, after the guests had gone, and the house was quiet again. She stood at the window in her new home, watching Theo asleep in his room. Then Julian wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You still think you were just the maid," he whispered. Amara smiled. "No, not anymore, because by now everyone knew. She was the woman who had walked into a billionaire's mansion with a mop and left, with a family, a future, and the kind of love money couldn't measure. Not pity, not charity, respect. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love and dignity often grow in the quietest corners far from the spotlight, then you're already part of something bigger. Because stories like Amara's aren't just fiction. They're reminders that grace doesn't come from wealth, but from how we choose to see each other. If you believe in stories where justice rises, where respect wins, and where people aren't defined by the job they do, but by the heart they carry, then stay with us. Like, share, and gently tap that subscribe button, because we're just getting started, and the next story might be the one you've been waiting for. Until then, stay kind, stay curious, and never underestimate the person you almost walked past.